All right, welcome back to Real Life Struggles, everybody. And we are joined again by JAMTAG. I've asked JAMTAG to be on the channel because he's pretty smart and he's going to help me pick apart this video. And if I get stuck on something about evolution, he's kindly offered to step in for me. But before we get started, as you know, because we've talked before, I started as a young Earth creationist who went to an old Earth creationist, who I would say now is somebody who believes the Earth is old but is open to evolution. Theologically, I just don't know enough about the science because of my education. What would you say to somebody who thinks you can't believe in the Bible and evolution at the same time?
I would ask them if they would like lessons in English literature, because anybody with any background at all in literature who reads the Bible would laugh at you when you told them it was supposed to be read literally.
And I pretty much agree with you.
Wait a minute, before you play the video, Nick, I
Sure.
just want to say a couple things. First
Sure.
of all, I'm not sure if Nick complimenting my intelligence is a good comment on my intelligence or a bad comment on his, but I'll take it. Second of all, my educational background is computer sciences and mathematics and teaching. I also have a teaching background in music. I did not go to college for music. I learned it as an autodidact, but I have all the other educational backgrounds for education. What I really do like to focus on is the concepts that these people get wrong. So I'm going to focus on ripping apart what he says about logical fallacy, and I'll jump in on the evolution stuff when Nick asks me to. And I got to remember that Nick's on the screen to my right and you're on the camera in front of me, so it looks like I'm not looking at you when I'm talking to the audience if I look at Nick.
I plan to do what I do in my videos where when they say something about the Bible I don't agree with, I'll chime in. And also just when they generally get the scientific method wrong.
I would also like to tell your audience why I'm interested in this stuff in the first place. In college, I did convert to Christianity. I started going to evangelical churches because they have the best music. Let's just be honest. If you're going to play music in a church and you want to play fun music, you go to an evangelical church. I never bought into the doctrine. I learned how to speak the language. I know what they mean when they shout out dog whistles. I understand the insidiousness of what they're saying, but I never got indoctrinated because I didn't care about any of that and I knew they were wrong. And I'm interested in tearing this down because through my experiences teaching at an evangelical Christian high school, I learned that this system is actually abusive to children, and I do not tolerate that.
Yeah, I will agree. Telling people don't believe science, believe the Bible, and then they find out science is real, then they start to doubt the Bible. I will agree with you on that one.
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm glad that they teach this as well as teaching the purity culture, because it's very hard to prove that the things they say in purity culture are wrong. But if I can prove that the things they say about young Earth and old Earth creationism are wrong, maybe I can still help the kids.
Please consider teaching this to your youth group, starting with junior high. They can digest this stuff. They have to start getting these things. We need to start teaching our kids higher thoughts, bigger ideas, and ways of identifying logical fallacies.
Okay, so he wants you to start teaching your children about logical fallacies in junior high school. Do you know why? Because we teach geometry in 10th grade in most states. And in geometry, the entire class is about logical argumentation. That's all that a mathematical proof is a logical argument. You need to teach it to them before we do, because we might teach it correctly.
Have you ever tried climbing a staircase with broken stairs? Hopefully not, because it's impossible. The same thing goes with climbing an argument with unsound or broken steps. It may look like it can be used safely, but once it's put into practice, it collapses. The logic is not able to hold up to scrutiny. We continue our look at logical fallacies and how to spot them. Specifically, do the arguments for evolution have sound stairs to climb?
I'm just going to stop it
Can you
there
pause
to
it?
say, yeah,
Yep.
I'm going to guess the answer to the question about evolution is yes, but also going to point out that young Earth creation is pretty much a big stack of logical fallacies on top of a logical fallacies. So this is a bit of the pot calling the kettle black.
On top of that, he's using a false analogy, which is a logical fallacy. I have climbed broken steps multiple times. How do you fix them?
With a hammer and nails.
Right, but if you can't get to them, how do you fix them? Like, how do you fix a broken staircase if you can't climb it? Like, you got to be careful when you climb it, but you can climb it. Just like I can create an argument that does use a logical fallacy and still come to a valid conclusion. I just haven't supported it properly. It's not a good analogy. It's a false analogy. Logical fallacy number one for Mr. Guy who's going to teach us about logical fallacies.
Scientists say that the Earth is however millions of years old, or scientists say that the universe is this many billions of years old. They say that, and I'm just going to trust them. You're not smarter than the scientists. I'm not smarter than the scientists. I'm just smarter than you because I'm listening to the scientists. What do we say to those people?
That is a fallacy. That's the, it's called the faulty appeal to authority. And the funny thing is, it doesn't work on me because I'm a scientist. And so when scientists say this, I'm like, I don't say that. I'm a scientist.
When we talk about stuff or matter or life or energy.
I want to split it there for a specific reason. So what he's just done is set up a is explained what a false appeal to authority is. And he actually named it wrong. It's an appeal to false authority. If I write a book on astrophysics and then you cite my work on astrophysics, that would be faulty authority because I have no authority to speak on astrophysics. But if Neil deGrasse Tyson writes a book on astrophysics and I cite that, that's not a faulty appeal to authority because he is certified to speak on that. What he's doing is Mr. Astrophysicist is teaching us about philosophical concepts because he's not an authority on that. Additionally, he mentions that he doesn't say these things because he's a scientist. No, that's not the problem with people saying scientists say. The problem with people saying scientists say is that scientist is a really fuzzy, really broad concept. You've got to get into the specifics of what science the person practices. And then, you know, you can say like biologists generally say, or astrophysicists generally say, but you really can't say scientists generally say. He's perpetuating the incorrectness in the original statement instead of actually correcting the fallacy. And he's making a faulty appeal to authority. Logical fallacy number 2 from the guys teaching us about logical fallacies. How far are we into the video?
34 seconds. And I'm just going to say, I honestly just feel his entire point is wrong because the average person, yes, they might say, well, scientists say this, so we have to believe it, blah, blah, blah. Anybody that's really investigating it, though, they're not going to say, well, I have to believe it because scientists say. I believe it because the evidence is there. So I'm not looking at, oh, I have to believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old because Neil deGrasse Tyson says it is, or Dr. Hugh Ross says it is. Well, I say it because I've independently looked up the information, and it's pretty solid that the Earth and universe are old. If I'm quoting a scientist, it's not, you know what I'm saying? I'm not quoting the scientists just because we have to believe whatever the scientists say. We believe what the evidence says, and we follow it to its conclusion.
Well, and you also get into the point where when you have evidence, evidence trumps logical argumentation. When I was about 9 years old, I was riding my bike down the street. To a casual observer, it would have looked like I was riding my bicycle at about 35 miles an hour because I had just come off of a hill when for no apparent reason, my face bashed off the pavement and the bicycle was no longer moving. Okay, upon later investigation, I found out that the bearings in the front wheel had locked up, and that's what made the accident happen. Could have happened to anybody, but it happened to me. But to the casual observer, just watching that accident happen, they wouldn't have that information, and this would make no logical sense. But that doesn't mean they stand there and go, well, that's a logical fallacy. That didn't happen. You know?
Right? My face says it did. All right, Ready to hunt out logical fallacy number 3.
Things are
It won't be
eternal,
long.
or that they had a beginning point.
I'll leave it up to the scientist.
A lot of times people will say science says.
Sure, yeah.
And then it becomes a reification fallacy because science doesn't say anything. Science is a set of tools. It takes a person to say something. But a lot of times the reason people will phrase it science says is because it sounds very impressive, right? I mean, it's rhetorically persuasive because we all respect science as a tool. It puts people on the moon, makes computers work, and so on. We respect that, we should. And I respect them if they say scientists say, because they've at least taken a step in the right direction. But most people don't. They'll say science says because you put a face on it, all of a sudden you got a person who can make mistakes. The appeal to authority is tricky because not all appeals to authority are faulty appeals to authority.
Right.
I do have a certain degree of respect when a scientist makes a claim about something. Here's my research, and I believe that this rock that we collected from the moon, it's basalt, and here's my reasons for believing that. Okay, I would accept that. That's not a faulty appeal. A faulty appeal is when you appeal to an expert when they're commenting on something that is either outside of their area of expertise or where they have a noticeable bias that would cause them to draw a wrong conclusion in that area. You'll notice that evolutionists fit both of those criteria, at least in my worldview. First of all, when a scientist talks about what happened billions of years ago, he's not doing science. Because science is about what happens in the present. It's about studying the current operation.
We actually need to go back a little bit because he just changed topics very well, actually. He's a good speaker. What he was talking about is the guy said, I'll leave that to the scientists. And then he immediately came in and started talking about when people say, I trust the science. That's called a straw man argument, and that's logical fallacy number 3 from the guys teaching us about logical fallacies. And this one is hilarious because in the middle he does an aside to say if they say scientists, that's okay. And now he's changed topic and he's talking about how when scientists talk about the past, they're not doing science anymore, which is not correct. But I'll let them finish that up before Nick and I tear it apart.
Did they change the definition of science since the time I read it in the dictionary and they made this video?
You know what they're doing, Nick. Maybe we should, maybe you should fill the viewers in. The historic versus observable science or whatever they say, that nonsense.
Yeah, so Answers in Genesis and a lot of other young earth creationists, they invented these 2 different definitions of science. And to them, there's historical science, which is basically observing things that happened in the past. Then there's observational science, which is what they say is they're testable and repeatable and observable. But it kind of stems from this either misunderstanding or just completely ignoring what the observation is in the scientific method. It's not that you have to observe something happening in order to make science. You just have to make an observation about something that's in the world. And this idea that you can't conclusively prove something if you don't observe it happening is, to me, it's like saying, well, so this guy says, I'm going to kill Bob. Then he goes and buys a gun from a gun store and he tells the gun store owner, I'm buying this because I'm going to kill Bob. Then there's a video camera outside that is recording him going into the apartment, and he looks at the camera and says, I'm going to go kill Bob. Then he goes in and shoots Bob. Then he goes outside and he looks at the camera again and says, hey, I just shot Bob. Well, then the police arrest him, but oh no, we didn't observe him shoot Bob because there's no camera in the apartment. So I guess we can't convict him. Yeah, ridiculous. You have all of the other evidence that points towards he killed Bob.
And
just like
and what the young earth creationist would say to that is right. And God said, like, to me, this doesn't, it just doesn't, all right, it's stupid on the face of it. If someone is an expert in something and you're not, you trust them. That's how the world works. End of story. You don't go to a mechanic and ask him how to bake cake. Don't go to a goddamn theologian and ask him about science. It's stupid on the face of it.
Oh, and I just want to point out one more thing before we continue. So the title of this is Jason Lisle dismantling evolution. And we're, I don't know, a minute and a half in. He's mentioned evolutionists, but hasn't talked about evolution. But they're doing another thing that really angers me, where they say it's about one thing. So they said it's about evolution. Then they've been mentioning cosmology. But as they're talking about cosmology in the age of the Earth, they bring up evolutionists. Because to Answers in Genesis and their like, there's only two people in the world: evolutionists and young Earth creationists, who are the only real Christians. And it really annoys me because it confuses people that don't have an understanding of science. And they think, oh, I don't want to believe in evolution because I don't want to believe in all of blah, blah, blah. And I don't think the science is behind it. But I do think the science is behind the Earth being old. But, oh, it's all the same thing. So I can't believe in it because I can't, separate the two. And I hate them for doing this.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why at the beginning I pointed out that evidence trumps logical argumentation. If I've got evidence that something happened, you can have all the logical argumentation you want for it happening a different way, and it doesn't matter. Evidence trumps it. If I've got a sign with a bullet hole in it, I know somebody shot that sign. You can come up with all the logical argumentation you want to make it different. I still know somebody shot the sign.
Yep.
It happened a long time ago. That's a history question. Okay. And so he's already outside of his expertise. He doesn't know what happened billions of years ago any more than anyone else. And so you shouldn't be intimidated by scientists say what happened billions of years ago. Well, they can't even predict the weather 1 year in advance. Keep that in mind. And secondly, there is.
Okay, I got to stop it because he's annoying me again. Cosmologists.
Yeah, that's great. Like
evolutionary
they can't predict the future, so we.
And meteorologists are three separate branches of science.
And on top of that, he's like, they can't predict the future, so how can they tell you the past? Like, do I need to be able to tell you what I'm doing in 2 hours to tell you what I did yesterday?
Gee, I got to ask, how did we ever write a history book? Because nobody alive now was alive in the times of the Roman Empire. So how is it possible that we've written a history book?
Have you read their history books? They just make that up too.
I did go to
I worked at a school that used their curriculum for every class. The history is just as wrong, if not more so, than the science, which is why on my main channel, I'm focusing on retelling the history at this point to dispel all those myths.
Interesting. Yeah, I did go to a young Earth creation teaching private Christian school, but I honestly don't remember much of anything.
The history book for 10th grade history taught the lost cause myth.
The lost cause myth? Sorry.
Yeah, the one that says that we never should have freed the slaves and the Civil War wasn't about slavery because slavery's good for black people.
Yeah.
That was what was taught in the history textbook at this school. Abeka, the second largest producer of Christian schooling curriculums in the U.S., Abeka teaches the lost cause myth.
There's a bias there. Those scientists who believe in billions of years tend to reject the biblical worldview. And once you
sorry, I'm going to start chunking this up more than you wanted to, but that also very much bothers me. This insistence that you can only be a real Christian if you're a young Earth creationist, and if you're not a young Earth creationist that believes in evolution or believes, in billions of years, then you must reject the Bible and reject God. Fun fact, there's more people alive in the world that accept evolution than there are atheists alive in the world. There's 1.5 billion Catholics, and Catholics accept evolution. There's only 300,000 atheists, approximately.
I'm going to make it real simple. Nobody has the right to tell you what you have to call yourself based on what you believe. Those are personal choices that are to be made by you and you alone. Additionally, no one can tell you what to believe. That is a personal choice that you need to make for yourself. And anyone who tries to do any of those things is engaging in high control tactics off of the bite model, which is how we identify a cult.
Reject creation, you need the billions of years in order to have evolution and so on, in order to try and explain away the creation worldview. So that's what makes it a fallacy.
All right, before we hop in the next one, did you want to say anything else?
I don't think so. I think I pretty well tore them apart. I do want to remind the audience we've spotted 3 logical fallacies from them so far.
And I would like to remind, sorry, what was I going to say? I don't remember.
I would like to remind everybody that Nick just forgot what he was going to say.
Let's just remind everyone that young Earth creation is not science, no matter what they want to claim.
There's formal fallacies. Now, formal fallacies deal with the structure of an argument. And I would say the most common formal fallacy that occurs in origins debate is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. And affirming the consequent has this form: if P, then Q, Q, therefore P. I find even scientists make this mistake, which is kind of interesting to me. So let's say my theory P predicts Q, and I do observe Q, therefore my theory is true. Although the observation that your theory made a correct prediction doesn't disprove it, it doesn't prove it either. Because there could be other reasons why you've observed that. If it's raining outside, then the grass will be wet. That's true. And you go and you observe, well, the grass is wet. You see, therefore, it must be raining outside. Well, that doesn't necessarily follow, because there could be other causes for why the grass is wet. Maybe somebody left the sprinklers on. Maybe somebody dumped a bucket of water outside. There are other explanations for that. Sometimes evolutionists will do that, and they'll say, well, evolution predicts that we would find a hierarchy in organisms, that we would find that it's possible to organize organisms into a taxonomic tree. Mm-hmm. Now, that's true, but the fact...
Okay, I wanted to stop it before he went into taxonomy, so if we can rewind it a little bit when we restart, that'd be cool.
Sure.
All right, so here's the problem with what's going on in what he's saying. First of all, I look at the evidence, and then I say, what is the most likely way all this evidence got here? So if I go outside and the grass is wet, I'm going to be like, hey, the grass is wet. I'm going to withhold judgment as to how it got wet until I make further observation. I'm not of substandard intelligence. So I understand that there's hundreds of ways the grass could have gotten wet. But then I notice that the trees are wet. And then I notice that the road is wet. And then I notice that my neighbor's dog is wet. And then I'm thinking it probably rained. Because for all those things to get wet, that's the most logical solution. That's how evolution works. Oh, hey, there's bones here. Oh, hey, they look like they come from animals that I've never seen. Oh, hey, they look like they come from animals that nobody's ever seen. Oh, hey, but this fossil is pretty similar to that one, but it's obviously a different animal. Oh, here's one that's similar to that second one, but it's a... And you get all this evidence and you say, okay, this is how it came about. Like yes. Anytime you're dealing with history, whether it's scientific history or socio-political history or world history or universe history, anytime you're dealing with history, ultimately what you're doing is looking at the evidence and coming up with a story that fits the evidence. The problem with young Earth creationism is it doesn't fit any of the evidence. None of it. So that would be logical fallacy number 4. I'm not sure of the name of it.
I just wanted to make the comment that isn't what young Earth creation does to try to prove the Earth is not billions of years old basically the same thing that they're accusing evolutionists of doing?
When they say the Earth is 6,000 years old because the Bible says the Earth is 6,000 years old, and then say, look, the Bible says the Earth is 6,000 years old, so the Earth is 6,000 years old. That is literally the best example of this I've ever heard. They use it in almost every intro to philosophy textbook, actually, because it's one of the best examples.
Sure.
That's true. And you go and you observe, well, the grass is wet. You see, therefore, it must be raining outside. Well, that doesn't necessarily follow, because there could be other causes for why the grass is wet. Maybe somebody left the sprinklers on. Maybe somebody dumped a bucket of water outside. There are other explanations for that. Sometimes evolutionists will do that, and they'll say, well, evolution predicts that we would find a hierarchy in organisms, that we would find that it's possible to organize organisms into a taxonomic tree. Now, that's true. But the fact is, I, as a creationist, make exactly the same prediction. I would expect that, because God has instilled order into His creation, and He's told us to have dominion over the animals. We couldn't do that. If each animal were totally unique, we couldn't classify them, we couldn't study them. And so God has organized organisms into a taxonomy. Cars can be organized into a taxonomy. That doesn't mean that they evolved from a common ancestor.
So there's a couple things going on here with what he's saying. First of all, humans do have a propensity to see patterns where they don't really exist. And we also have a bias for assuming things are dangerous instead of making no assumption about them and then basing our knowledge on facts. And these are we evolved this way because we wouldn't have survived in the wild if we weren't this way. If I hear a noise in the bushes and I run away, I live, regardless of whether that was a lion or the wind. If I hear a noise in the bushes and I stay there, I might die because it's a lion. So over time, all the people who assume that something is not dangerous have a significant breeding disadvantage. Because
it's hard to breed when you're dead.
Yes. Like today we could probably do that, but back then they couldn't. So we have this bias to assume that things are dangerous. And then we also have this bias to see patterns. Those are real things that he's bringing up. And I do want to give credit where credit is due. But then he's saying that we could arrange cars into a taxonomic model when we could not do that. Because the way taxonomy works is I look at all the things all the organisms have in common. And then I say, okay, how many things have to be different before they become another classification at this level and then this level, so on and so forth. So while I could make an analogy to a taxonomy from cars by saying, well, you know, you have cars and you have two-door cars and you have four-door cars and you have stick shifts and you have automatics. That would be a pretty good analogy. It's not actually a taxonomy. Even if I extend it to vehicles, it's not a taxonomy, because what does a motorcycle have in common with an 18-wheeler? Nick, go ahead. What does a motorcycle have in common with an 18-wheeler?
They both have motors?
I would disagree. A gasoline engine is called a motor, while a diesel engine is called an engine. So they don't. They both have motors.
They both have wheels.
Well, I mean, kind of technically, but I can't interchange them.
True. Yeah, I get your analogy thing, and also I don't think it was. I can't remember if it was a Dr. Lisle or a Wretched Radio. But they actually tried that. They did like this nested hierarchy of things. And then in their nested hierarchy of powered vehicles, you know, which included things like trucks and cars and stuff, they put a bicycle, which is famously not powered because there's no motor.
Sure it is. I power it. It's
right.
Powered.
Maybe that's what their thing was, but
that is exactly what they're thinking. But that's the problem with that analogy. Like, it just doesn't work. And now we get to the summary guy.
Yeah.
So that was their fifth logical fallacy, by the way.
Yes, it was. Go Todd. Let's see what he has to say.
And also, taxonomy predates evolution by over a century.
No, it means that they have a common designer. The fallacies, they are everywhere. You have just heard one for...
Okay, so right there, it's because they have a designer. Occam's razor states that the answer that multiplies the least antecedents is most likely the correct answer. The classic example is it's 1 a.m. I drive past a building and there's a whole bunch of cars in the parking lot. So I ascertain that it's a bar. Like,
The simplest solution is most likely the correct one.
that is a simple way to say it, but that breaks down a lot, which is why I like to be specific that what you're trying to avoid in order to obey Occam's razor is assumptions.
Okay.
So I know that bars are open at 1 a.m. I know that people, even though they shouldn't, drive to and from bars. And I know that not many other businesses are open at 1 a.m. So if I see a building with a parking lot full of cars at 1 a.m, I assume it's a bar unless I have information to tell me otherwise. So when he says that they're similar because they have a designer, he is assuming a designer exists because we have no evidence of a designer. What science says, science actually doesn't say that science isn't designed because science isn't capable of saying that. Science says, I don't know.
Right.
But when you try to pull at the individual pieces that science does know, then you get into a problem. Like what I say, because I am a Christian, and what I say is science is a system. Science is a system of rules and laws that God made.
I'd have to agree with that. Yeah.
But then once he made it, he just let it do its job. And so what he's doing is he's violating Occam's razor. Logical fallacy number 6 from the people talking to us about logical fallacies.
How am I bad at math? 1, 4, and 5 from Road Trip to Truth. However, there are more, and I would like to encourage you to consider getting this resource at wretched.org/roadtrip. And showing this to your kids in youth group. There's a study guide that will walk you right through it, and I'm telling you, you are going to get into conversations with your kids you didn't know they were thinking the thoughts that they got going on in their noggins.
You have to brainwash them. Did that come out?
Yeah, it did. Going back to what you said about common designer, I have heard 2 different viewpoints on it. One of them from one of the atheist YouTubers that I listen to, maybe closer agnostic, but anyway, and they're like, well, that's a fine thing to say, but in order for it to be a scientific acceptable theory, you have to be able to test it. So if it was common design, how did he do it? What can we test to lead ourselves to that, and a bunch of stuff like that. I will say probably the only person I've seen make this argument, though, and then actually back it up with a massive amount of evidence is Hugh Ross, who's a old Earth creationist astronomer. He actually wrote an entire book where he said, this is why I don't feel evolution is scientific, and this is why I feel my theory is scientific. And he actually made a bunch of really good points, which is why I'm still kind of on the fence.
Do you know who Gutsick Gibbon is, Eric?
Yes, I listen to her all the time.
She has a video where she goes through the problems with the various forms of young Earth creationism and exactly at what point in the scientific story they violate the science. And she does the same for old Earth creation, theistic evolution. And it's a really, really good takedown of it. And I'll be completely honest with you. I know she was raised young Earth creationist, but I don't even know if she's an atheist or a Christian or what, because she just doesn't talk about it, because that's not important. What's important is people are lying to you.
I think she said in a couple videos before she considers herself more agnostic. She's not there. But she also said that she goes to stuff like biologos, because that way, when people try to criticize her and say this, like, oh, well, these people that you're quoting, they hate God. She's like, no, look, they love God. They're Christians, Checkmate.
Yeah, I mean, just basically, I've always been the type of person that's very interested in how things happen. So when I look at a situation where roughly 40% of the Christians, 30% of the US population believes that science is wrong, that women are supposed to be subservient to men, that consent in sexual matters just does not exist. You don't do it before marriage, and after marriage, the woman does it whenever the man wants. Like I look at that and I go, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where in this country we are electing politicians who support this nonsense and want to make legislation based on it? Like, how did we get here? And when I go back and I look through everything, this argument that we are having in politics and involving religion and involving science, it's literally been going on since 1781. It started when we started trying to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and move to the Constitution, because the Articles of Confederation provided strong state government and very weak federal government. And the Constitution flipped that. And we now have a very strong federal government and much weaker state governments. Though they're still pretty powerful, but they're a lot weaker than they were under the Articles of Confederation. Immediately, the opposition to the change started talking about God-ordained human sovereignty. and we should have a weak central government because the stronger the central government is, the less personal sovereignty you, the citizen, have. Never mind that they weren't actually taking anything from the people directly. They were taking stuff from the states. And even back during the Revolution, Thomas Paine's, some of his writings, there's an entire page in The American Crisis that can be summed up in one sentence. They want to take your guns. Like, this has literally been going on since the Revolution. And all they do is just move the target continuously. It was personal sovereignty, and then of course they're going to take on science, because they always take on science, even though they always lose when they take on science. You had several populist movements throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s. You had the Know Nothings, you had the Granger Party, you had the People's Party. Yeah, it sounds communist. Probably would have been called communist if it didn't predate Marx. But it's just the way, like, people work. And the problem is that during the Second Great Awakening, Christian movements became grossly aware of just how isolated Middle America, geographically speaking, is. Once you get across, I've been to every one of the 48. I've driven through every one of them. I drove truck for a year so that I could have that experience. When you cross the Mississippi, you're in a place where all the towns are small. Some of the largest cities on the other side of the Mississippi are smaller than some of the smallest cities on the other side of the river. And that's because that's where they grow the food, which means there's just these huge open areas of land with food growing on them. I literally drove for an entire day and saw nothing but fields out there. Well, when the population is that isolated, and especially before television and the internet, I could tell them just about anything, and they really didn't have any way to reach outside of their communities. That's persisted. They started homeschooling, they started charter schooling so that they can teach whatever they want. Part of the problem is that the liberals actually redefined separation of church and state. Are you aware that until the 1920s, there were blasphemy laws in the United States that were
No,
enforced.
Actually, it
Yeah.
wasn't.
Yeah, because the original framers didn't see a blasphemy law as violating church and state. Because if I'm just out in public and I say Jesus Christ and I say something negative about Jesus Christ, I'm not exercising my freedom of religion because that's not part of my worship. The Constitution only protects the worship, was the original framing of it. That's how the original people who wrote it looked at it. Liberals in the early 20th century extended it. Here's the problem. Once you extend it so that you can use it to be able to say mean and rude things to people, then they can turn around and go, oh yeah, you want to come in and make sure we're not beating the kids? We're Christian. Separation church and state. Oh, you want to come in and make sure we're teaching real science and history? Separation of church and state. And it was actually the liberals redefining it and extending the definition that created that situation. And so now in the middle United States, again, geographically speaking, we have a situation where the vast majority of the population is not being educated properly on science and history from a very young age. They're not being taught appropriate things about psychology. They're not being taught appropriate things about their own development. They're okay. And like, these people aren't stupid. Like, there's IT firms out there. You know, some of these parents know how to modify the router and block internet sites and things like that. And they teach other people. And if somebody has only ever been exposed to that, how do you expect them to believe what you're saying? Is that even a reasonable ask?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And honestly, when you were talking about, the science thing, back when places like Answers in Genesis started, that's kind of what they were. It was, this is what mainstream science says, and we oppose these certain beliefs. We don't think the earth is really that old, and here's our science behind it. I don't have a problem with that. Science should be challenged. That's the entire point of science. Somebody says, I think this, and we think, no, let's try to prove it wrong. Oh, we failed. Okay, hey, it must be a pretty good idea. But when they turned it into the big bad evil atheistic naturalistic world hates God and Christians, and we got to defend ourselves against it. When it came into a religious issue, that's probably when I realized that might have been the start of my journey out of being a young earth creationist. Just like, okay, so you debate a scientist and all you do is quote the Bible. Well, how are you going to convince Bill Nye the Science Guy that he's wrong because the Bible says it when he's an avowed atheist who doesn't believe in the authority of the Bible? Like, where's your science? Oh, I studied a lot and found out you actually have none.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, it was a long time ago that you told me this, but if I'm not mistaken, you were not raised young earth creationist. You became a young earth creationist as an adult, correct?
No.
Okay.
I was raised.
You were raised young earth.
Yeah, I went to Sunday school where I learned about Adam and Eve and Noah's flood, and I went to a Christian school from preschool until 5th grade. And it was actually in my adult years was when I started doubting.
Okay.
And I started, looking up, pretty much read everything off Answers in Genesis, everything off International or Institute for Creation Research, all of those, and then Old Earth blogs and slow journey, and here I am.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's actually a type of child abuse. When I take a child and I tell them they're in something called science class, and sometimes they learn science, like they learned about mitosis, they did learn some science, but then when it comes to evolution and things like that, all I'm teaching them are flawed arguments against it and not actually teaching science. As far as I'm concerned, that's child abuse. If I had child and I taught them the wrong colors intentionally, that's child abuse.
Yep.
So how is a school teaching the wrong science or not science and calling it science? And the same thing with history, not child abuse. It's not.
We just watched 6 minutes of video that claimed to dismantle evolution. And from my viewpoint, they barely talked about evolution. They mixed it in with a bunch of cosmology. And I don't think they failed to dismantle it. What do you think?
I think they dismantled themselves better than they dismantled evolution, to be honest.
Dr. Lisle dismantles his own argument.
These are arguments that are best characterized as fodder for the believer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody
exactly.
who believes it and doesn't really understand it says, Lisle addressed it. I'm good. And they still just continue to not understand it. And to be perfectly honest with you, that's okay. I don't really I don't care about that. Stop telling your kids about it. Stop telling your kids they got to believe it.
I agree. Yeah, and that's why I like making these videos, because, you know, I see this on the Facebook groups I'm in and stuff, and like, oh, you know, so-and-so did such a good job. And man, this is such great evidence. Why don't you just test it? I'm like, okay. So I sat down for 20 minutes and looked up every argument against it and posted it as a comment. And then they laugh emoji reacted to it. I'm like, yeah, because if you had anything, you would have come back at me.
I had one guy post a link to a site I'd never heard of, saying that it was fair and it was balanced and it didn't do the same things that everybody complained the other young earth creationists sites did, but that it was a bit sarcastic. But, you know, if you can take that in stride. Right. I think everybody's aware I could take sarcasm in stride. So I went ahead and looked at it. And the whole article is about butterfly migration. The guy keeps asking how the wing evolved. So I go and I say that and I say, that's not what the article's about. He's expecting the guy to address something the article's not about. You know what the original poster's response was? How did the wing evolve?
Google.com. How did butterfly wings evolve?
Like, okay, I understand why you support him now, idiot.
Right. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. I think we did a pretty good job of taking down this video. I got 5-6 logical fallacies against their 5-6 logical fallacies. So yeah, good times. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks. This was your idea. Thank you. And sorry about how hard this is going to be to edit.
Yeah, that's fine.
Have a good day, Nick.
Yep, you do. Bye.